Good afternoon. How do we handle huge global problems without the U.S. and China having some way to work together? As we welcome to our series on COP Stocktake here at CSIS, I'm Joseph Majkut. I'm the director of our Energy and Climate Change program. The goal of this series is to have a few conversations with experts, friends, colleagues from within CSIS to put a little bit of body around our thinking around COP. What are the geopolitical stories that that precede this meeting, that are going to go on during it, and are going to follow this meeting? And I'm joined today by Ilaria Mazzocco, my colleague from CSIS, Senior Fellow, Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics, and a person from whom I've learned a ton about how the Chinese government and Chinese firms think about technology innovation, think about industrial policy, think about climate technologies as part of their broader economic strategy. And I'm hoping we can have a conversation today about the two largest and most important economies in the world, 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and how their relationship defines progress or arrests it at COP. So Ilaria, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Joseph. I'm very excited to have this conversation today.
There's lots that we can talk about. You and I talk about this stuff all the time, but I'd love to start with the status of the U.S.-China relationship going into COP. We know that the two countries are kind of at loggerheads over a variety of security issues, the sort of geopolitical tensions that exist between the two and seem to be rising. But on climate change, where are these two big nations?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to discuss today, and we will talk about it, is the Sunnylands Statement that came out in November. So it was a statement focusing on cooperation on climate moving forward. It's very promising because the cooperation is really sort of stalled over the past few years. But taking a step back, climate has been the bright spot in the relationship for several years now. So in a way, it almost carries the weight of the broader relationship. So there's always this sense that if you can't cooperate on climate, then the two countries can't cooperate on anything. But also that if you can find some diplomatic path forward on climate, it's very important for the relationship. So sometimes I think almost the climate part of it, the actual decarbonization, gets put to the side because it's more indicative or metaphorical of the broader health of the relationship.
Like in that context, like the process by which the U.S. and China are talking about climate, whether they're talking about it at all, is like a temperature check on the U.S.-China relationship?
Definitely, yes. So, for example, this past year, the background is that, of course, during the Trump administration, there wasn't a lot of cooperation or dialogue over climate because it wasn't a priority of the administration here. But then after that, with the Biden administration, COVID, there wasn't a lot of exchanges. China was largely closed off to international travel, for example. There was a bit of a stall. And then last year in 2022, we actually had a complete breakdown or pause in dialogue because Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan China as a sort of retaliatory measure cut off dialogue on many fronts, including climate. So you really had a long pause, and it restarted this year when Kerry started going to Beijing, and you had a lot more discourse. And that's just Kerry going to Beijing was a broader signal of, in a willingness of Washington and Beijing to restart broader dialogues, right? So Kerry going there and talking about climate was like the first step, while, Raimondo going there and talking about, export controls was like one of the later people who was sent once dialogue had sort of restarted.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think we can talk about the Sunnylands Statement in a minute, but let's take a step back, right? Because there's a couple things here that I think are important. One, the personalities at play do matter. Right. So John Kerry has been the leader for the U.S. on engagement with China on climate. And he has a long history of working with his counterparty, Xi Jinping, is how you would say it, right? Xi Jinping, in the Chinese government. U.S.-China cooperation in advance of Paris really allowed the Paris Agreement to come together. Right? That was one of the things that helped bridge this long political divide between developing and developed countries. It gave everybody agency and responsibility or every country agency and responsibility in approaching this big global issue. The Sunnylands Statement, same place where President Xi and President Obama had negotiated before Paris. Was this an attempt to get the band back together and kind of demonstrate that multilateralism in this relationship is not dead?
Well, certainly bilateralism, right? I don't know about multilateralism, but no, I think there's a little bit of that. I think the challenge in a way is that leading up to Paris, it was very clear what cooperation was aiming at. It was aimed at getting China to make commitments and sort of sign on to Paris, right? Mm-hmm. To the big commitment. But since then, policy internally in China has really changed, right? So now you actually have pretty ambitious targets. They could definitely be more ambitious. Implementation is still a challenge, but I think the things within China have really changed. So yes, there is a role to play in sort of pushing China to be a little more ambitious, to adopt methane targets, for example, et cetera. But it's not, I think the U.S.'s role in making sure that China actually has targets, for example, it's not the same, right? And the other issue is that traditionally there's been a lot of cooperation on climate tech, on clean tech, and that has actually become like a really an area of competition and a really sort of controversial area. So I think there's been this sort of breakdown in the traditional areas of cooperation, and I think they've sort of struggled to find something new. So getting the band together, but also trying to figure out what works in a new sort of dynamic, a new world.
So you wrote a piece just after the statement came out and preceding COP28 saying that this statement actually does kind of give a little bit of momentum to the COP28 negotiations. What's in it, and why is that your argument?
Yeah, so I co-authored this with Deb Seligson, who is one of our non-resident fellows. And our argument was really, first of all, I should say that expectations were very low, right? Mm-hmm. So it does come from a point when, we're coming into it from a moment when there was basically no dialogue, and it just restarted this year. But yes, I think it's very promising that there's a restart of dialogue. There's really, the language really indicates that we want to restart the channels of dialogue and exchanges. There's an indication that they will actually restart and put the working groups together. This was a commitment. The working groups were part of the agreement that was reached in Glasgow a couple of years ago. Again, she and Kerry were central to that, but they were never really put on the ground. So this would be important on getting actual technical voices exchanging and discussing a lot of different issues.
Right.
You also have this interesting agreement to sort of coordinate on some topics, for example, interesting on the carbon capture and storage projects. So both countries commit to doing 5 large-scale projects at the same time, but separately. So that's kind of interesting. It could be a path forward or a model for certain types.
We might have to figure out how many C's we can fit into this conversation, right? It's commit, cooperate, coordinate, and compete.
Yeah.
We got to be able to do at least 2 more.
Yeah, exactly. So then there's the carbon capture, right? Yeah, and then there's the usage versus storage. Right. But I think it's interesting that both countries definitely are very interested in this. There's a lot of funding available in both countries for these projects. Certainly, if you could get them to scale and make sure that they can actually work, then it would be quite a breakthrough, right?
It's fundamentally necessary to meet net zero targets. Every modeling study shows you need an incredible amount of carbon capture or direct air carbon removal.
Right. And so you have that in the statement, right? So that's quite interesting, I think. There's a commitment to continue a subnational cooperation, which actually has been the most fruitful in the past few years. When national level dialogue kind of broke down, you still had a lot of exchanges at the local level. So California has really been a leader in this.
Right.
And in fact, when we saw that when Gavin Newsom went to China recently, he had very successful meetings because of that, building on that relationship on climate. So you have a lot of these different elements there. There is there's an agreement to cooperate on at COP, so we'll see how exactly that plays out. China also released its long-awaited action plan on methane. Again, something that the U.S. had sort of been asking for. So, I think generally speaking, they're very good signals there that came out of this statement.
So what I'm hearing is you kind of, nothing is particularly transformative, but we should view this outcome as it's like a restarting of a dialogue that probably should have been happening already. There's sort of some additional pledges on the margins, right? Chinese are going to do some stuff about methane. Funny enough, actually, my first public policy paper ever was about Chinese and U.S. cooperation to reduce methane emissions when I was in graduate school. We wrote it in like 2012. And it's funny now that that's like becoming part of the policy stream. I don't think our paper had anything to do with the Sunnylands Statement, though.
We should have, maybe.
Yeah. So I hear that. I also wonder, like, what do we hope to see as a result? So let's take the subnational, right? So I actually expect, if we kind of try to go one level deeper, Chinese firms and the government have done actually a really great job deploying a bunch of renewables, right? So you mentioned we don't need to worry about Chinese targets as much anymore because it's like there's sort of like there's this big ongoing transition, or like there's a very fast addition of renewable and clean technology. There's some trouble getting the coal stuff.
Coal is still
Yeah.
an issue, yeah.
But we had Chinese scholars come to CSIS last spring, which was after China had lifted travel bans. It was kind of the first time people had been able to come around. And there's a ton of interesting stuff going on in regional power markets in China as they're trying to figure out how do we get a bunch of renewables on board? How do you monetize storage? These are the same challenges that power sector people in the United States are working on. Do you sense, even at this moment of kind of like large scale competition, there's still being a lot of desire and willingness on the part of individual scholars, regions, and cities to collaborate and kind of learn together?
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, I think it's a tricky moment to navigate a lot of these issues because the geopolitics have become a lot more tricky and a lot more challenging.
Yeah.
But I think, even if you go beyond climate, there is still a lot of interest in scholarly exchanges and academic collaboration in a lot of different fields. Now, figuring out exactly how to do that in a way that doesn't clash with national security interests, and that's a concern, I think, for both governments, is a challenge, right? And I think a lot of universities and scholars are sort of figuring that out. But, there are certainly areas where we could do this, and I think there would be there's a lot of benefit to doing this.
Right.
Of course, figuring out the way to do it in a safe way is sort of the tricky part of that.
What do you like? One thing I'd love to hear from you is I'm kind of looking at this from the U.S. perspective, because I think what John Kerry is trying to argue implicitly and explicitly is that cooperation between the U.S. and China is absolutely necessary for the world to succeed on climate. I would say that is not a position that everybody in Washington, D.C. holds, right? That there are a whole new, Nikki Haley in the Republican climate debates, like, well, if we want to do stuff about climate change, we need to go to China and tell them to reduce their emissions because they're the largest emitter in the world. You have increasingly a sense of like maybe the path to joint success is through competition for clean energy technology, for using border adjustments to kind of compel emissions reductions in China. What is your sense of that debate in the U.S., but moreover, like, what's your sense of that debate within China? How does China want to deal with the U.S. when it comes to issues of global public good?
I think there's almost a little bit. Yes, I think part of the challenge is actually defining what cooperation even is, and I think I've spoken with scholars in China. They're also trying to grapple what that means, right? And sometimes they'll point to certain like companies that provide the technology say, well, why can't they compete in the U.S.? And that's become a big issue that, you and I talk a lot about, when Chinese companies want to come and invest in the United States in some of these technologies, and they're not necessarily always welcome. Like how do we assess risk? What is the real challenge, and why not? Looking at the cost benefit of that. And I think like in China, there's a sense that sometimes no matter what they do, they can't win because the China issue has become so politicized. So I think there's a little bit of that. Now, I think taking a step back, ultimately for climate change, I think the most important actions will have to come domestically. Mm-hmm. I think as important as cooperation is, whatever, actually getting, to targets, achieving those targets for China is going to have to come from China, right? It's not going to be something that the U.S. does. Same for the U.S., right? We actually need to make certain kinds of take certain kind of legislative action, certain kinds of investments, like through the IRA, for example, in order to actually reduce emissions. So I think there is an element where we should remember that ultimately a lot of the responsibility is going to be domestic, but I think there's a lot of those enablers that happen, through that international cooperation in some places, allowing commercial competition in certain other cases can be helpful as well. So I think it's kind of a complicated issue, but a lot of different tools are probably going to be necessary, right?
So I found another C. If you if you said, well, like for the world to meet its climate targets, what you really need is coherence between the U.S. and China, right? Both have to reduce their emissions. And the reason why is like slightly different. China has huge emissions. U.S. has relatively large emissions, but we have like a kind of more important political role in around the world. And China we just need to get the emissions down to meet the climate targets that we need to do for this century. So but you need them both to go down over the next few decades, which is pretty rapid. And you need both political systems to display the willingness and ability to reduce emissions quickly if we're going to meet climate targets. So that's another C, coherence.
I love that. Yes, coherence is definitely going to be important. And I think that's actually sort of my thing that I keep pointing to. I think an area where cooperation can be really fruitful is sort of global governance and sort of getting more coherence across different approaches in different countries. And there, I think leadership between the U.S. and China can be really important in sort of figuring out a way to sort of agree on certain standards, agree on certain approaches, making sure that even though countries maybe have different systems that where, they sort of speak to each other in some ways, right? And so I think that's going to be quite important moving forward because ultimately the U.S. and China are not going to use the same systems, right? There's such different political systems that we're not going to see the same type of approaches.
Yeah, and it just doesn't feel like a world in which we're going to have this kind of kumbaya moments on climate when the U.S. and China are jockeying pretty hard in other areas. Let me put you slightly on the spot. If say you take say U.S. political leadership wants to move to a more competitive space, right? We're going to compete for technology. We want the global economy to be competing on carbon intensity of economic production. You can kind of pick your zone of competition. Do you think the U.S. can win?
That's. I don't know, right? I think it really depends on what the parameters are. So I not to evade your question, but I think actually competition can be good, right? So I think we should be competing for technology and reducing, emission intensity and all these things, right? And so I think there certainly is an argument to be made that there could be an advantage if the U.S. does it right?
Yeah, but take example of EVs and EV battery technology, where you've done a lot of really excellent research. Like if you want to buy the best EV, most affordable and best EV battery in the world today, it's a CATL battery, right? Or it comes from a Chinese company. Chinese companies are producing EVs with incredible specifications for you read about these prices on the internet. It's insane. It's like $10,000, $12,000 4-seat EVs with reasonable range. Like that, the way that Chinese firms have been able to drive down the costs of clean technology really potentially creates a global public good, but is the U.S. going to be willing to import a lot of that stuff? And how do we create competition? I mean, the IRA is nominally supposed to do this, but it looks pretty daunting when you look at the key examples.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is daunting, right? And I think, I think in a way with the IRA or, even in Europe, there's a lot of talk about replicating what China has done, but we're forgetting that China achieved this also through a lot of foreign direct investment, right? I mean, Tesla is doing just fine in China.
Right.
And they were invited in because they brought in a lot of, high quality competitive production that raised the bar within China. So I think, we want to keep that in mind. I think, ultimately the other thing is Chinese companies are going to continue to internationalize, right? These are big companies. They have very good products. They're very competitive, and it's going to be unavoidable that they're going to export more, and they're also going to start producing more outside of China. So when we think about diversification and how to take advantage of supply chains and bringing in more of those supply chains in the United States, I think we need to account for that, all right? And sort of think of the risk factors. You and I talk about this a lot, and actually really take advantage of the fact that these companies are willing to invest abroad, right? And sort of figure out how they fit into our paradigm of supply chain diversification. So I think if the U.S. is able to do that, then I think it could be in a very good position. But of course, that's going to take a little bit of a readjustment of thinking, not just cutting out Chinese companies completely, but sort of, thinking how you can take advantage of their position internationally.
And let's kind of want to return back to the bigger scale. So the COP actually is starting today as we record this, and there's already been a couple announcements of a loss and damage fund and agreement in that area. Kind of where do I have a good sense for what I think the Biden administration, what the U.S. government wants to see out of the negotiations this year and broadly out of climate action globally. What does the Chinese government, in your view, want to see out of these negotiations? And how does that kind of speak to the Chinese government's broader view on how climate change should be addressed?
Yeah, I think the challenge for China is that the past couple of years have been very challenging economically. And so you actually had sort of a high point in commitments that came in 2020 when China was coming out of COVID, economy looked strong, the rest of the world looked like it was struggling, and Xi Jinping made a big famous announcements of peaking emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2060. And then 2021, you saw a lot of activity within the Chinese bureaucracy to try and meet that. And then, 2022 hit and zero COVID strategy in China started breaking down. You started having very widespread lockdowns. The economy really tanked. And 2023 has been sort of a struggle in getting things started again.
Yep.
Of course, and also the past 2 years, we've seen energy shortages. You also see energy markets, which of course your program has covered a lot. They've kind of gone crazy. And so I think it's a moment when in Beijing, they made these commitments on climate, and I think they were pretty serious about them, but they weren't expecting the sort of macroeconomic condition and also geopolitical condition to change so quickly.
Right.
So my sense is that going into COP28, they're in a situation where they are still relatively committed to their targets, but they're probably concerned about being pressed on making more ambitious commitments. And so what we've seen is that you haven't seen really any big, bold announcements since 2021 because I don't think they really have the political will at the political capital at the moment to sort of invest in that. And I should say, we've also seen sort of a ramping up of permitting for coal plants in China in the past 2 years, which has been very concerning.
So it's very interesting. As you look further and further at the story, you just find these interesting nuances and stories everywhere. Xi Jinping and John Kerry are a little bit lame ducks at COP28. I think I'm pretty sure they've both announced that they plan to retire. This is probably their, the last show for the band. What does the future of U.S. and China climate diplomacy look like in your view? I mean, who are even the secondary or key players that we should be thinking about?
Well, I mean, I guess we'll have to see, right? Ultimately in China, Xi Jinping's commitment is the most important. I think he has been, I would say, actually in some ways surprisingly committed to climate, all considered. But this comes at a moment where there's a lot of different competing priorities, as I just noticed. And I would say what we're probably going to continue to see in China is a very strong commitment to ramping up renewables, and all variety of clean energy technology. So I think a lot of the commitments will come on that side. In terms of who's going to replace Xi Jinping and what sort of influence they'll have, I'm not sure.
Or what kind of viewpoint, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, really going to sort of I think we're still actually figuring out the bureaucracy more generally. There's been a change in a lot of the leaders in China at the moment, and we're still sort of figuring out who's in charge of economic planning, et cetera. So it is a moment when a lot of the leadership in China has sort of changed and the things are sort of reassessing. So I think we'll have to sort of wait and see on that. But it's difficult to imagine somebody with the same sort of experience and, Xi Jinping has decades of experience on UN negotiating, negotiating at the UN. And so, he knows all the actors, right? So I don't know that there is anybody with that exact background who could really replace him, which might make it challenging. That said, he came from a generation that was far less international. So I think now there's a lot more people that are younger, have a lot more of that international background experience. So they may still be able to interact very effectively on that front.
Yeah, and you're equally entering a time where people are sort of peaking in their career, or the people who are reaching the peak of their career have also grown up with climate change as an issue. It wasn't something that they arrived at as adults, right? Which is, I think, going to kind of more broadly just really change the way we both talk about climate change, talk about climate change policy, be much less about, we need to accumulate all this ambition. It's going to be much more about we need to achieve our ambitions. We need to do it right. We need to do it with these characteristics. And that might really be a place where coherence and coordination and competition all can kind of thrive, even if the sort of collaboration piece is diminished over time, because those are all about the nature of the transition, not so much about should or should not an energy transition happen.
Right. I think we are converging to a point where in both bureaucracies there is an agreement that you need to meet certain targets, and then it's more marginal about how much the targets are, which targets, etc. I think where the cooperation side of things will really matter is actually talking about the rules of the road, and and also I think moving forward there's going to be more and more need for discussions about climate finance for everyone, but definitely for the global south, for developing countries. And I mean, climate adaptation is probably going to be a bigger and bigger topic moving forward as well. So I think those are other areas of cooperation for the future. I mean, I think we'll have to sort of see how this plays out. But, again, going back to the Sunnylands Statement, what I see is that there's an effort to establish multiple channels of conversation on how to discuss and manage these issues.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we are at the end of this time. I know you're watching developments. I'm hoping that our audience can check out your work. And you wrote a great paper this year on Chinese EVs and the question of, is that industry overcapacity? And I'm sure we'll have more chance to talk about outcomes at COP over the next few weeks. So thank you so much for joining us. Colleagues who've joined us online, thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph.
Great. Joseph Majkut signing off. As you know, we'll have a few more of these as the COP meeting proceeds, tracking developments, trying to get some stories from on the ground. We're so grateful that you joined us today and look forward to seeing you next time.